There's a specific kind of person watching this right now. You have spent most of your life feeling slightly out of place, not lost, misplaced, like a book shelved in the wrong section of a library. The content is right, the quality is there, but nothing around you quite fits. You are too serious for casual conversation, too reflective for the fast-track version of success everyone else seemed to be running toward, too independent to fully belong anywhere, yet too self-aware to completely walk away from the world. And for a long time, maybe for decades, you carried a quiet suspicion, a feeling that sat just beneath the surface of your daily life, never loud enough to name, but always present. The suspicion that you were somehow late, that the window had passed, that while everyone else was building, arriving, accumulating, you were still somewhere in the middle of becoming. What if I told you that suspicion was wrong? Not just slightly wrong, but completely wrong. What if the very thing that made you feel behind, the slowness, the depth, the refusal to simplify yourself, was not a flaw in your design, but the design itself? Carl Jung, one of the most important psychological minds of the last century, spent decades studying exactly this kind of person. And what he found was not a profile of someone who failed to launch. It was a profile of someone whose launch required more runway, someone whose psychological structure was not built for early crystallization, because early crystallization would have broken them. This video is about that person. It is about why you felt the way you felt, why your life moved the way it moved, and why, if you are entering your 50s right now, or moving through them, what is happening inside you is not the beginning of the end. It is the moment your life finally begins to make sense. Stay with me, because what Jung discovered about this rare personality type is not motivational content, it is a map, and some of you have been waiting a very long time for someone to hand you one. The misplaced person, why you never fit the standard timeline. Let's begin at the beginning. Not your beginning, but the beginning of the problem. From the moment you entered the world of structured expectations, school, career, social milestones, you were measured against a timeline, and that timeline rewarded very specific things: speed, early clarity, quick commitment, invisible momentum. By those standards, you appeared inefficient. You hesitated when others advanced. You questioned when others complied. You sat with decisions longer than seemed reasonable. You changed direction when everyone expected you to stay the course. And slowly, over years, the outside world began to send you a message, subtle, never stated directly but consistent, that you were doing something wrong, that you were somehow failing at the basic project of building a life. Jung would have said this message was not accidental. He believed, and this is crucial, that modern society unconsciously pressures certain individuals to abandon their natural rhythm, to compress themselves into a shape that is legible to the culture around them. And the individuals who resist that pressure, consciously or not, are very often the ones whose psyches were never designed for the standard model of development. Some personalities, Jung observed, cannot solidify early without breaking. Think about what that means. Not won't solidify early, not choose not to, cannot without fracturing something essential in the process. Why? Because of how close they are from birth to what Jung called the unconscious. Born close to the unconscious. What that actually means. This is where Jungian psychology gets genuinely fascinating and where most people miss the deeper point. When Jung talked about the unconscious, he was not just referring to repressed memories or hidden trauma. He was describing an entire interior world, vast, symbolic, contradictory, and alive, that runs beneath the surface of conscious thought. Most people have a relatively thin connection to this world. They experience thoughts as instructions, feelings as signals, decisions as calculations. The rare personality experiences none of that. For you, thoughts arrive not as clear directives, but as living tensions. Two opposing ideas feel equally true at the same time. Emotion does not signal one thing, it signals many things, layered, sometimes contradictory, often impossible to resolve quickly. Decisions carry weight that others simply do not perceive because you sense consequences that haven't happened yet. Pathways that look clean to someone else look complicated to you because you can see the complications. This is not indecision, it is depth processing. But here's the problem. Depth processing is invisible from the outside, and what is invisible is almost always interpreted as absence, as slowness, as lack of motivation, as failure to commit. So early life for this type of person becomes a struggle, not because they lack ability, often their ability far exceeds those around them, but because the psyche refuses to simplify itself for survival alone. It cannot accept borrowed identities. It cannot perform coherence. It does not actually feel. It requires internal alignment, not just external function. And internal alignment is expensive. It costs time. It costs energy. It costs the kind of patience that a fast-moving world has very little interest in rewarding. Why your ego formed slowly, and why that was necessary. Jung believed that the central psychological task of the first half of life is building an ego strong enough to navigate reality, an ego that can make decisions, hold a direction, withstand failure, and maintain a sense of self under pressure. But he also warned, with unusual precision, that an ego formed too quickly becomes rigid, and rigid structures cannot hold contradiction. They can manage life when things go according to plan. When life bends, when complexity arrives, when the identity you built no longer matches who you actually are, the rigid ego does not adapt, it defends, and that defense becomes its own kind of prison. Your ego formed slowly, not because you were weak, but because it had to remain flexible enough to contain opposing forces simultaneously. Light and shadow, ambition and restraint, the desire for connection and the need for solitude, the drive toward meaning and the awareness of absurdity. These tensions did not resolve in your 20s, they did not fully resolve in your 30s, and so your ego kept widening to hold them, stretching instead of hardening, because hardening would have meant choosing only half of what you actually were. This delay came with a cost, a real one, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. You likely experienced exhaustion that made no rational sense. You could sleep 8 hours and still feel depleted. You could accomplish something significant and feel absolutely nothing afterward. You could move forward, actively, visibly, and still feel a quiet, persistent sense that you were somehow betraying yourself. This is what happens when a psyche refuses premature alignment. The world has several names for it: laziness, depression, lack of ambition, failure to launch. Jung had a different name for it: misdirected life energy. Your energy was not absent, it was not broken, it was not wasted. It was being conserved, held in reserve for a purpose that had not yet become visible. What you were actually doing all along. Here is a reframe that may change how you look at your entire past. While other people in your 20s and 30s were externalizing, building status, accumulating credentials, constructing reputations, and anchoring themselves to identities, you were doing something entirely different. You were internalizing. You were watching, absorbing, testing values against lived experience rather than inherited ideology. You were learning, slowly, through direct encounter, what doesn't work, what doesn't hold, what looks solid from the outside but fractures under pressure, what people claim to want versus what actually brings them peace, what success looks like in the cultural script versus what it actually produces in a human life. This knowledge does not arrive through reading. It does not arrive through ambition. It arrives through sustained observation over time. And here's the thing about knowledge earned that way: it does not decay. The person who locked into a role at 24 and built a career on certainty, that person has expertise, real expertise, but it is narrow. It works within the system it was built inside. The moment that system changes, or the moment life asks a question the system cannot answer, that expertise becomes a ceiling. Your knowledge is different. It was not built inside a system. It was built around systems, watching them, questioning them, noticing their limits from the outside. This is why it doesn't have a clean title. This is why it doesn't display well on a resume. This is why people who barely knew you probably underestimated you repeatedly throughout your life. But it is also why, under pressure, under genuine complexity, under conditions of ambiguity that make most competent people freeze, you don't. Jung had a precise name for what you were building during those quiet, unglamorous, often painful years of internal work. He called it tolerance for ambiguity, and he believed it was the single most important psychological resource a human being could develop, because ambiguity, he said, is the price of wisdom. You cannot be wise and be comfortable at the same time. The two conditions are fundamentally incompatible. You paid the price for years, often without understanding why, often without anyone around you able to see what you were actually doing. That changes now. Why early success would have been dangerous for you. This point deserves its own space because it is the one that surprises people most. Early success, the thing you may have envied in others, the thing you may have blamed yourself for not achieving, would have been genuinely dangerous for you. Not uncomfortable, not difficult to manage, dangerous. Here's why. Had you locked into a role at 25 or 30, one that brought recognition, financial stability, a clear identity, you would have built your life on a foundation that your psyche had not yet finished excavating. You would have constructed a structure over unexamined ground, and that structure might have stood for a decade, maybe two, but at some point, almost inevitably, the ground beneath it would have shifted, and when it did, the collapse would not have been gradual. It would have been total. This is not hypothetical. Jung documented this pattern exhaustively in his clinical work. The successful executive who wakes up at 52 with everything he was supposed to want in an interior life that is completely hollow. The accomplished professional who has followed every rule perfectly and finds herself at 50 unable to remember a single moment of genuine aliveness. The person who did everything right and arrives at midlife feeling inexplicably like a stranger to themselves. Jung called this the revenge of the unlived life, the return of everything that was suppressed, denied, or postponed in the name of efficiency and external performance. For you, this did not happen, or rather, it did not happen all at once. Your disillusionment came early and in fragments. You caught glimpses of the hollow structure before you fully built it. You dismantled false paths before they became permanent. You lost things you thought you wanted, and discovered with surprise that the loss brought something closer to relief than grief. That was not failure. That was your psyche protecting you from a future it could already calculate you would not be able to survive intact. Jung believed that nature is economical, that a psyche that delays gratification does so because immediate gratification would interfere with a deeper objective. And your deeper objective, the one your psychological structure was always quietly oriented toward, was not efficiency, it was integration. Integration is the work of bringing the whole self into alignment, not the self that society approves of, not the self that is useful, not the self that performs well, the whole self, including the parts that are inconvenient, contradictory, difficult to explain, and impossible to brand. Integration takes time. It requires conflict. It requires that you encounter false paths fully enough to understand why they are false, not just avoid them because someone told you to. It requires disillusionment, not just once, but repeatedly. It requires that you sit with unanswered questions longer than most people are willing to tolerate. And it requires, above all else, that you do not resolve the tension prematurely, that you stay in the uncertainty until the uncertainty teaches you something, rather than escaping into the first available certainty that presents itself. This is the work you were doing, quietly, often invisibly, often at great personal cost. And this is precisely why, when you cross the threshold into the second half of life, you do not arrive empty-handed. You arrive carrying something most people your age do not have and cannot quickly acquire. You arrive carrying foundation. Now here is where it gets important, because everything we have covered so far, the slow formation, the internal work, the tolerance built through years of sustained ambiguity, all of it is preparation for something that begins to happen in your late 40s and 50s that Jung considered one of the most significant psychological events a human being can experience. He called it individuation, the process by which a person stops becoming what the world expected them to be and begins, for the first time, becoming what they actually are. And for the rare personality, for the person who has done the underground work, individuation does not feel like disruption. It feels like coming home. In Part 2, we're going to go deep into exactly what this shift looks like from the inside, why your decisions suddenly feel final, why your tolerance for noise has dropped to near zero, why people around you are starting to notice something different in the way you carry yourself, and all of it means for the next chapter of your life. If this video is naming something you have lived but never heard articulated before, subscribe, not for motivation, not for hype, but for this kind of depth, because some lives don't peak early, they build, and we are just getting started. Part 2 is coming, and it goes even deeper.